As Europe carved its empires and mapped the world with ink and blood, Africa stood vast, unconquered, unbroken, and largely unknown to those who would soon claim to have discovered it. In the heart of the continent, kingdoms thrived with laws older than London, courts more orderly than Paris, and cities whose names the world would one day try to forget. Benin with its moats and bronze, Oyo with its cavalry and constitution, Inri, where kings ruled not with swords, but with sacred oaths. And yet, as Europe rose from feudal ashes into the age of empire, Africa was rewritten, not as a place of memory, but as a blank canvas for colonial imagination. Maps were redrawn, names erased, languages outlawed, art stolen, stories silenced. The kingdoms fell, not all at once, but piece by piece. Some to gunpowder, others to treaties signed under duress, others still to the betrayal of brother against brother, a legacy of divide and rule. When Nigeria was born in the shadow of British rule, it was not born free. It inherited not only borders it did not draw, but a curriculum it did not write. Children learned of the Magna Carta, but not the Oyo Messi. Shakespeare was revered, Orunmila forgotten. Independence was celebrated, but not the centuries of sovereignty that had come before. This is the story of what was buried, of what was stolen, of what must now be remembered. Because before colonization, there was civilization. And history, long silenced, is beginning to speak again. As Nigeria moved toward independence in the mid-20th century, a curious thing happened. The colonial education structure remained almost entirely intact. One would think that with the fall of British rule would come a renaissance in African-centered learning. But instead, post-colonial leaders continued to use British syllabi, British exam boards, and British-approved history narratives. Why? Part of the reason was logistical. The infrastructure for education had been built by colonial administrators. The institutions that trained teachers, printed textbooks, and set examinations were all foreign in origin. Changing that would take time, money, and political will. But another reason was psychological. Many of the first generation of African elites who led independent governments were themselves products of colonial schooling. They had excelled in it. To question its contents would be to question their own foundation. So history remained skewed. While students now learned about Nigerian independence heroes, the curriculum still placed heavy emphasis on European historical milestones. The Magna Carta was still more important than the Charter of Mandan. World War II was studied in detail, while the Oyo civil wars were never mentioned. In fact, for decades after independence, history itself was removed from many school curricula entirely. It wasn't just the wrong history being taught. It was no history at all. A generation of Nigerians grew up without formal instruction in their own past. They learned to revere colonial architecture, but not Nok sculpture. They were taught to speak the Queen's English, but knew nothing of Nsibidi script or IFA divination. This erasure wasn't just a consequence of British domination. It was a continued post-colonial choice to prioritize foreign narratives over native ones. And the impact? A population disconnected from its heritage. A people taught to look outside for validation. A nation that had forgotten it once, ruled itself in glory. The end of colonial rule should have marked a new era, one of cultural revival and historical reclamation. But in many ways, the new African elite reinforced the colonial erasure. Why? Because they inherited a system and were incentivized to keep it running. The new political class was groomed in European institutions, spoke European languages, and measured progress by how closely African states resembled their former colonizers. Paris, London, and Washington became models, not Inri, Oyo, or Timbuktu. In post-independence Nigeria, traditional rulers were increasingly sidelined. Palaces were reduced to tourist attractions. Ancient spiritual systems were vilified in the name of modern religion and development. Chiefs and elders were replaced with bureaucrats, while indigenous governance structures were deemed obsolete. Many African leaders, perhaps unintentionally, continued the colonial mission. They promoted Western-style development while ridiculing traditional knowledge. They celebrated Independence Day, but not the founding days of their own pre-colonial states. The failure to integrate African historical narratives into national identity has had long-term effects. It created a vacuum, a gap in cultural self-awareness that still haunts Nigeria today. And worse, the few who tried to resurrect indigenous memory were often branded as radicals, tribalists, or enemies of progress. But history cannot be buried forever. The story of Africa's stolen past is not just metaphorical, it is literal. Thousands of priceless artifacts were taken from African kingdoms, and now sit in the museums and vaults of the West. None is more emblematic of this theft than the Benin bronzes. Looted during the 1897 British invasion of Benin City, these intricate bronze plaques, ivory tusks, and ceremonial objects now reside in the British Museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and dozens of institutions across Europe. For over a century, Nigeria has demanded their return. And finally, the world is beginning to listen. Germany has pledged to return hundreds of pieces. Other institutions have made symbolic gestures. But the deeper question remains: can you ever truly return what was stolen, if the memory that surrounds it has already been erased? The return of the bronzes is about more than art. It's about dignity. It's about correcting the lie that Africans were incapable of high civilization. It's about reviving a suppressed history. Each artifact that comes home is a piece of memory restored. But more than that, it is a warning to the future that no culture can survive if it allows others to tell its story. Perhaps the most insidious part of Nigeria's historical erasure happened in the classroom. For years, history was removed as a core subject from Nigerian secondary schools. Generations of students passed through the school system without any structured understanding of their past. They graduated knowing Shakespeare, but not Chinua, the Cold War, but not the Sokoto Caliphate. Why? The reasons are complex: underfunded schools, government neglect, and a deep-seated discomfort with Nigeria's multi-ethnic past. How do you teach history in a country where truth could spark conflict? Some feared that teaching the full story of Biafra, of the Niger Delta resistance, or of ethnic kingdoms could reignite ethnic nationalism. But avoiding history only deepened ignorance. A nation that does not know its past becomes a people that cannot imagine its future. Recent efforts to reintroduce history to the curriculum are promising, but they must be accompanied by truth, not propaganda. Not a sanitized version of Nigeria, but the raw, complex, and powerful truth of what came before. Walk into a Lagos classroom today and ask a student, who was the Oba of Onrama? Who was Aize Inriomalu? What was the structure of the Oyo Messi? Most won't know. But they'll know Beyonce's last album, TikTok trends, and Hollywood's versions of African royalty. This is not their fault. It is a result of decades of systemic forgetting, of being told implicitly and explicitly that African greatness is in the past, and even then, it wasn't that great. Modern Nigerian identity is fragmented. Many young people view their own cultures as obstacles, not assets. Tribal marks are mocked. Traditional names are anglicized. Native languages are fading. Cultural amnesia is when you no longer remember that your people once built empires, created art that baffled Europe, and governed with principles long before colonization. We can't blame young Nigerians for forgetting. We must blame the systems that never taught them to remember. But not all is lost. Across the continent and diaspora, a new generation is reclaiming African memory. One video, one tweet, one podcast at a time. Young Africans are no longer waiting for governments to approve their history. They are creating content, writing books, hosting shows, and challenging false narratives. From TikTok, historians explaining the Edo Empire in 60 seconds, to digital artists reconstructing the architecture of ancient intrigue, to Afrobeat musicians referencing Yoruba cosmology in their lyrics. This is the beginning of an intellectual and cultural revolution. Afrocentric education startups, Pan-African documentaries, and traditional language apps are booming. Museums are being built by Africans, for Africans. There is a hunger to remember, to reconnect. What colonialism tried to kill, the internet is helping revive. Erasing a people's history is more than just an intellectual loss. is a psychological wound. When Africans are taught that their ancestors lived in huts while the rest of the world built empires, it creates a sense of inferiority. When children grow up never hearing about Oba Eware or Aidze Inri Omalo, but learn everything about Winston Churchill and Napoleon, it distorts their self-perception. Colonialism didn't just take resources. It implanted deep doubts. It told Africans that they needed saving, needed civilizing, needed Western guidance. And for many, these ideas have remained embedded long after the colonizers left. This psychological colonization shows up in many forms. The preference for foreign religions over indigenous spirituality, the adoption of foreign names in place of native ones, the pursuit of validation from the West, be it through accents, education, or aesthetic standards. Without historical context, many Africans struggle to define themselves beyond survival. They don't see themselves as heirs of kingdoms, but as victims of poverty. To reclaim African confidence, we must reclaim the African past. When people know their history, they walk taller. They understand that their ancestors were not just survivors of slavery. They were originators of culture, architects, philosophers, scientists. Historical memory builds cultural pride, and cultural pride builds self-worth. Not all African leaders forgot the past. Figures like Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana and Patrice Lumumba of Congo recognized that the colonial legacy was more than political. It was psychological. They believed that Africa needed a united cultural and historical awakening. Nkrumah was deeply inspired by ancient African civilizations and sought to rekindle that pride. He launched history departments, cultural centers, and museums aimed at reversing colonial narratives. Muammar Gaddafi, though controversial, pushed for a gold-backed African currency and Pan-African institutions that would rival Europe. He referenced ancient African glory to justify the continent's future independence from foreign powers. Yet many nationalist leaders, especially in countries like Nigeria, took a different path. They focused on borders created by the British and ignored pre-colonial connections. They celebrated Independence Day, but not the founding of empires that preceded colonial rule by centuries. This has created a contradiction. Pan-Africanism demands memory and unity, while nationalism, especially of the post-colonial type, often thrives on division and forgetting. To heal, Africa must remember not only the trauma of colonization, but also the power of what came before. The Inri Kingdom was unlike any other in African history. Rising as early as the 9th century in what is today southeastern Nigeria, Inri civilization was built not on war, but on spiritual influence. The Aidze Inri was not a king in the military sense. He was a spiritual figure, chosen through signs and rites and responsible for healing, cleansing, and maintaining cosmic balance. Inri's power spread through persuasion and spiritual diplomacy. Towns invited Inri priests to cleanse them of abominations, settle disputes, and install sacred symbols of harmony. Inri priests practiced non-violence. They were forbidden from shedding blood. Their tools were language, ritual, and cosmology. Their system of government was decentralized, consensus-based, and deeply rooted in Igbo cosmology. It emphasized omenala, customs and laws, enso ani, taboos and environmental ethics, each scarification, a mark of spiritual prestige. For centuries, the Inra Kingdom maintained peace across Igbo land through spiritual authority, rather than military might. Why is this significant? Because it defies the colonial narrative that African societies only understood rule through force. Inri's model of ethical governance was one of Africa's greatest contributions to political thought, and yet it's almost entirely absent from textbooks. The Benin Kingdom, centered in modern-day Edo State, was one of the most sophisticated and enduring pre-colonial states in West Africa. Founded around the 11th century, Benin evolved from a loose confederation of communities into a centralized monarchy led by the Oba of Benin. It flourished politically, artistically, and architecturally for centuries. The city of Benin was famously described by early Portuguese visitors in the 15th century as being as well organized and clean as cities in Europe. The streets were wide, straight, and laid out in a grid. Unlike the chaotic narrative often assigned to African settlements, its massive defensive walls, spanning over 16,000 kilometers, are considered one of the largest man-made earthworks in history. They were both protective and symbolic, a boundary between the sacred city and the outside world. But perhaps Benin's most enduring legacy lies in its art. The Benin bronzes, cast using the lost wax technique, are renowned worldwide for their intricacy and depth. They depicted scenes of court life, battles, spiritual rituals, and the hierarchy of the kingdom. These weren't just decorations. They were historical records, carved in metal. Benin's system of governance was also highly organized. The Oba ruled with the advice of noble chiefs, Uzama, guild leaders, and religious officials. The kingdom maintained trade networks with Europe while fiercely protecting its sovereignty. Benin resisted British colonial interference for decades. It was only in 1897, following a British military expedition disguised as diplomacy, that the city was attacked, looted, and burned. Thousands of artifacts were taken. The Oba was exiled. The city was devastated, and the memory of Benin's grandeur was quietly buried, except for the art in foreign museums that testified otherwise. The erasure of African kingdoms isn't just a Nigerian problem. It's global. In most Western countries, world history curriculums still center Europe. Africa is often portrayed through the lenses of slavery, poverty, or tribalism. Rarely are students taught that Africa had universities, legal systems, diplomatic relations, and city-states. Ask a European student about the French Revolution and they'll give you details. Ask them about the Songhai Empire and you'll get a blank stare. This global omission reinforces colonial hierarchies. It makes African civilization seem like an afterthought, if it's acknowledged at all. Even when African history is taught, it's often through an anthropological or archaeological lens, rather than as dynamic political history. But things are changing. Diaspora scholars and activists are challenging these narratives. African studies departments are growing, and digital platforms are making African history accessible across borders. Still, the task remains enormous. To restore balance in world history, we must teach Africa not as a victim of history, but as a maker of it. Reclaiming history is not just an academic exercise, it's a matter of identity, dignity, and development. Here's what Nigeria, and Africa more broadly, can do to restore its historical memory. Revamp the curriculum. History should be taught at every level of education. From early childhood to university, Nigerian students must be grounded in pre-colonial African history. Build indigenous museums. Cultural artifacts must be returned and displayed in world-class museums built in Africa for Africans. These institutions should be centers of education, not just exhibition. Support local historians. Scholars who research and publish African history need funding, visibility, and institutional backing. Oral historians must be included and recorded. Use technology for memory. Podcasts, YouTube documentaries, VR reconstructions, and language apps are powerful tools for reconnecting younger generations with ancestral memory. Celebrate indigenous holidays. Beyond Independence Day, national holidays should mark the founding of kingdoms, heroic resistances, and cultural milestones. Revive traditional languages and scripts. Nsibidi, Ajami, and other African writing systems should be studied, preserved, and taught. Pan-African collaboration. African nations should work together to develop a unified historical curriculum that transcends colonial borders. Remembering is a political act. It is a defiant refusal to accept someone else's version of your story. Africa's greatness was not a myth. It was a reality. And when we teach it, we give birth to a future rooted in truth. History is not just about the past. It is about who we are today and who we dare to become tomorrow. The erasure of pre-colonial African kingdoms was not accidental. It was strategic, coordinated, and global. But so too must be our response. We must rebuild not only what was stolen, but what was forgotten. Rebuild pride in Inri's diplomacy. Rebuild awe in Benin's artistry. Rebuild the memory of African civilization, not as a shadow, but as a sun. We are not orphans of history. We are the authors of our future. Let the world know. Let the children hear. Let the memory rise again.